Welcome to Cancer Talks, a podcast sharing stories of personal transformation and collective healing from people who have been touched by cancer. My name is Claire, and I'll be guiding today's conversation. If you're listening on an iPhone, click the plus sign in the upper right corner to follow our show and get notified when a new episode is released. My guest today is Mayak Pingree. Mark is a PhD candidate in comparative literature with a background in philosophy. Inspired by his experience with cancer, his research explores the possibility that illness and disability offer new ways of thinking what it means to be human in the age of ecological collapse. He has taught college courses in philosophy, film, and literature, and is currently in training to become a psychoanalyst. Mark lives in Queens, New York, with his orange tabby named Phaedo. Hi Mark, welcome to Cancer Talks.
Hi Claire.
So I thought we could open with why you decided to be on Cancer Talks.
Yeah, great question. I think when the opportunity presented itself, I was unsure if I really wanted to do it, but I listened to a couple of episodes that you sent me, and it really sparked a kind of like a reflection on my journey with cancer and reminded me of the ways in which that journey is sort of always ongoing. And even though now it's been a little over 10 years since I went through it, it's still always with me. And there's always more to process, always more to say. And it also reminded me of the ways that kind of when I was going through it, I didn't really lean on community. My local community I did, friends, family, things like that. But like, as you know, other people who've actually been through it, I didn't really connect with a lot of support groups. I kind of I ended up doing a lot of it alone. And I guess, when I was listening to some of these other episodes, I was thinking this is a way to kind of like maybe touch in with some of that a little bit. I was listening to other people's testimonies and other people's experiences, and like, of course, things resonated with me right away. And I was like, wow, this is maybe something I ended up missing out on a little bit.
But I kind of like what you're saying, which is it doesn't have to be a missed opportunity because cancer is something that anybody processes their whole life.
Very true.
It's maybe just as valuable to share those stories now.
Yeah.
Different.
Totally.
Yeah.
No, that's a very good point. Yeah.
I haven't really thought about that. And I also, I guess we've interviewed a few people who have cancer like long behind them, but who are much older than you. How much do you think about cancer these days?
Yeah, interesting question. Well, I guess it just sort of like, it depends. But it definitely is always, kind of in the background. And I think, cancer is something that's just like, it's all around us, right? I'm sure, as you know, and it sort of haunts culture, it haunts society, it haunts our personal lives in ways that it always sort of looms large and as something that may hit us at any time, or somebody we love. Just before you got here, I was texting with a friend who's gone up to Buffalo, and she's sort of figuring out what type of cancer diagnosis her father has. So, it's certainly ever present. Sometimes it's in the background, and some of my academic work, I sort of engage with it in the background, and sometimes it's very in the foreground and sometimes it's in the background, but I would say it's kind of like never really gone.
Yeah. I'm wondering whether we should start with your trip and experience in the place where we think you developed something that became cancerous, or whether we should start with your cancer experience and go back to that. What do you think?
I guess it's up to, what do you think? What sounds more interesting to you?
Let's go chronologically.
Okay.
I think, not that chronology is better, but I've been thinking a lot about what came before and what came before and what came before in a lot of different ways in my life. But I think, like, with cancer in particular, what we already sort of started talking about doesn't really end.
Right.
And then on the other side of the spectrum, we could think about how it's hard to say when it begins.
Totally.
Impossible to say when it begins, really.
Yeah.
Even though it can feel like it begins at the moment of diagnosis.
Yeah.
So yeah, let's start somewhere where maybe it began.
Okay, yeah. Well, I like what you said. I mean, I just want to say before I start with that is I think there is always something kind of like metaphysical about cancer. It's interesting you bring up like where does it begin and when does it end and all of that. It's interesting. Maybe we could talk more about that at some point. But yeah, I mean, for me, I mean, my story is one that started, you know, when I was 19 years old. I was living in Salt Lake City, Utah. I grew up Mormon. I've since left the church, but at the time I was deciding to go on a Mormon mission, and so I you know, you kind of submit your papers to the church. They and a few months later they assign you where you're going to go. You don't choose where you're going to go. You just kind of roll the dice, and you're going to spend 2 years in a place that you have no idea where you're going to end up. So I got my mission call in the mail, and it's a big event for Mormon families. Everybody sort of, you know, you get the thing in the mail, the family comes, everybody like is going to find out your fate for the next 2 years. The weird part for me was that day there was a tornado that actually hit Salt Lake City, which is a super rare, like there's a bowl of mountains surrounding Salt Lake City, so like it never has tornadoes, but on this particular day a tornado actually hit the city.
Wow.
So yeah, it portended something. I mean, it was quite an event. So the day was super weird. I remember seeing green clouds in the sky. I remember like, you know, it hit downtown Salt Lake City. I was in the suburbs, so I wasn't like in the path of it, but it was a chaotic day.
Yeah.
I get this mission call. I open it, find out that I'm going to Russia, and I'm being sent to this city called Yekaterinburg. And over the course of the next couple of years, I'll live in a number of different cities in the Ural Mountains. It's on the sort of west side of Siberia. And I mean, at the time, I didn't know. I mean, the church didn't tell us kind of like what to expect. I remember hearing things like there are water filters at every apartment. Don't eat the fish. They told us like don't ever eat fish.
Oh, wow.
For any reason.
Because the fish is from the water.
Yeah, and like
what does it say about the water?
Right, but yeah. What they didn't tell us, you know, was that, and I found out many years later. Was that we were, especially in one city called Chelyabinsk, I was 2 hours outside of a Mayak nuclear reactor plant. It's a city called Mayak. And it's actually the major weapons manufacturing plant in the Soviet Union during the Cold War to produce nuclear weapons. So there were, you know, two major sites. In the United States, there was in Hanford, Washington. In the Soviet Union, it was in this place called Mayak. And I didn't know I was living a couple hours outside of this place. But the Soviets had been dumping nuclear waste into this river over decades, in fact. And once sort of ecological studies were done on the place, they said the environmental impact on this was comparable to about 20 Chernobyls. Wow. Like that bad. It wasn't just one catastrophic accident. It was just like decades of dumping shit into the river. So,
right.
So
less newsworthy.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Anyway, so yeah, and I was, you know, I was living there for these 2 years and came back. I wasn't sick, of course, while I was there. It would be many years later until I would finally get diagnosed. So I imagine that's probably where it came from.
Yeah. What do you remember from your experience of being there? Was it, what was it like?
I mean, I guess I would describe it as a sort of a 2-year existential crisis.
Yeah.
I think in general, I mean, I think I realized that I had gone for sort of like, in some ways, cultural pressure reasons rather than because I was really devout and trying to convert people. So there was kind of a lot of, what am I doing here?
But you were sort of going through the motions of trying to convert people.
Yeah, I mean, in Russia, converting people basically doesn't happen. Also, I mean, the church didn't have official legal registration in some of these cities, so we were not allowed to like proselyte in any way.
Whoa.
We weren't allowed to wear like the usual Mormon missionary name tags. Most of it was a service mission, which for me was actually kind of a good thing, because I felt when I got there very uncomfortable with the idea of trying to convert people.
Yeah.
And was happy to do service.
What service did you do?
Like we helped like build kindergartens.
Oh yeah, totally.
You know, like taught English classes. I think in one area, like And like, of course, these things were in part to drum up some interest about like why we were there.
Yeah.
And if the Russians came to us and were interested in religion, then we could talk to them. But we were not, by law, we were not allowed to like address people as like missionaries trying to convert. So, but yeah, I mean, it was cold. It was lonely. It was like I didn't know what I was doing there for months on end.
Were you friends with any of the other people on the mission?
Yeah, I ended up making some friends, and I think there was a group of missionaries that were equally like me in their existential crises, which was actually like, so we had a bit of a community. We were all kind of like, how did we end up here? What are we doing?
Yeah.
And like, but it was also a very interesting experience. Like I could have, I mean, it would have been very shameful if I had left. Like, it's very frowned upon. You're sort of treated as a social pariah if you like give up on this experience.
Yeah. But you don't remember any health issues during
I don't
that time?
remember any health issues.
You felt
Not dramatically. Yeah.
healthy,
right.
young.
Strapping 19-year-old,
Yeah, right.
Like, I don't know. I mean, but I do remember a number of other missionaries getting sick.
Oh, interesting.
There were bouts of like violent vomiting all night. There were like things that were happening. And we just thought, I mean, we're in a foreign country. We don't know what's going on. You got some bad meat, like, I don't know, food poisoning.
Wow.
But I think that it was probably worse than that.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Have you spoken to anyone else, and did anyone else have
I mean, I've lost touch with a lot of that community now that it's been 20 years since I got home, and I've sort of gone in a much different direction in my life.
Yeah.
But I do recall hearing about one other missionary who got back and was diagnosed with cancer.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, so at least one, but I've lost touch with most of that community, so I'm not really sure how bad it was for the rest of them or anything like that.
Yeah.
So.
Yeah, and then fast forward, do you remember the moment you received your diagnosis?
Yeah, oh yeah. I mean, it was, I was having a lot of health issues that I couldn't really connect the dots of like I couldn't like figure out what all these symptoms were. I was having like severe back pain for a while. Mm-hmm. It would only happen in the evenings at like after 9 p.m. and it would like, I'd have like 1 hour of severe pain where I could hardly even stand up. And then it would just go away and I'd be okay for the rest of the 24 hours. So I was having that symptom. Then I moved to London and to like do a master's degree in philosophy in London. And that symptom went away. But then I was having like severe itchiness in my limbs. I thought I had like scabies.
Whoa.
I thought I had bed bug scabies. I was like scratching my arms and legs at night. I went and saw the doctor. They're like, no, you don't have that. So, and then that kind of passed. Then I came back and I was back in Salt Lake City. Night sweats. Finally went to see this doctor. I remember the day it was snowing, and it was snowing so bad. I was trying to get to my appointment. I was late, and like they turned me away in the morning. They were like, "You're like 20 minutes late, so the doctor won't see you." And I was like, "Are you serious? Like it's snowing. It's a blizzard out there." Like, okay. So I went to leave, and like they told me I could come back that afternoon. I come back that afternoon. And this was a really amazing detail, like so surreal. I go back to the receptionist, and I don't know if she's new or what, but she's sort of like looking at her computer and like fumbling over forms. And the question she asks me right before I see the doctor is, "Are you related to yourself?" And I'm like,
what?
Right. And for me, like, I don't know, for like my philosophical training makes me think about.
She didn't mean to say that.
She didn't mean to say that. Like, are you related to, like, I think she was trying to think about, I don't know, emergency contacts or like, right? Yeah. Like she just totally like, it was like a Freudian slip. And she's like, "Are you related to yourself?" And I'm like, wow, that's a philosophical question. Like, I'm actually not sure. Like, I think so. I mean, there's the unconscious, there's the ego. Like, is this a sort of splitting moment? Like, it sort of like went quiet, and I was like, yeah, I think I am. And she's like, "Oh, I'm sorry. Whatever." So I go in, see the doctor. He's like kind of rushing me through things. He's like, "Gotta go." He's like apparently going on vacation. He's like, I'm going through the symptoms. He's like, yeah, okay, whatever. You're like young and healthy. What's the problem? And then, I don't know, something must have clicked because his like expression started to change. And then he left the room. He's like, "I just want to go talk to one of my colleagues." And I'm not thinking anything of it. I'm like, okay, yeah. And then he's like, let's do an x-ray. So we do an x-ray, and then he pulls up this image, and there's like some like cloudy mass in my chest. And he's like, I don't want to scare you, but I'm pretty sure this is cancer. And I've already set up an appointment with an oncologist because we can't wait on this. We need to move. And I was just kind of in shock. I was like, I think my response was like, it was almost as if like,
that's so quick. There was no come back for a test,
exactly.
Then wait a week.
Yes.
Whoa.
None of that.
Yeah.
It was like, and I received the news almost as if like I had missed the train and had to wait 10 minutes. I was like, oh, okay. That's okay, cancer, got it. All right.
Yeah.
No big deal. So sounds like a thing. I guess we got to deal with that. And totally like flat tone. My affect like was not absorbing like what I was hearing.
Yeah.
Went and did some blood work. I remember I left the doctor's office and was just like going back to work, like just driving back to work as if like I did my appointment. Now I got to go to work, saw the doctor. And then somewhere like on the way before I showed up to work, I was like, what am I doing? Wait. I'm going to go back to work.
Yeah.
So
what stage was it?
Stage 3.
Wow.
So it was at stage 3. Didn't know that at the time, of course.
Right.
But yeah, and so I told my boss, look, I think I have cancer. I have to go home. But yeah, then we went through the biopsy procedures to sort of gauge where we're at, and there was some fear that it was, if it got into my bone marrow, then it would be stage 4, and that would be really bad. But the bone marrow biopsy confirmed that it was at stage 3. But I remember another crazy, terrifying detail was that, like, I saw the notes from the tech, from like the radiology or whatever, the scanning person looking at, not the actual oncologist, but the one who like types the notes in.
Yeah.
And I got that in my email before I saw the oncologist. And it was like, the spleen has been like completely overtaken by tumors, like the chest area, like the whole, like there's just like tumors everywhere.
Whoa.
And I'm just like, I guess I'm gonna die? Like, I guess, like, because I don't have no way to contextualize this information. Like, I don't even know.
And you write about, I forget which piece it actually was, but you've written about, like, the moment of a cancer diagnosis as sort of a death.
Yeah. No, I think so.
You want to talk about that a little bit?
Sure. Yeah, I think a lot of people who've been through this experience would probably be able to relate, but I think it does feel like for me, and maybe not in the moment, but certainly in retrospect, it was a kind of death. Like, it was a sort of symbolic death. It was definitely an end of a life. Everything changed.
Yeah.
And I had to rethink my relation to just about everything, and the sort of, the seismic impact of that trauma is, it definitely splits you into two different, like, modes of being in the world, I feel like. So yeah, I think there's something that did die that day, in some ways for the better, in some ways for the worse, but I've commonly talked about it as a sort of dying experience, and subsequently a rebirth, I guess. But
what are the two, or how would you describe, like, the two things you felt split into? Yeah,
good question. I mean, now it feels like a sort of loss of innocence in a way, a sort of like a split between the naivete of my youth, and also just like brought a lot of kind of perspective about what really matters and like what I want to focus on. Personally, I think the biggest change was that before cancer, I was very much a sort of a lone wolf. I was just very isolated. I kept to myself. I didn't get close to people. I wasn't able to, like, my romantic relationships would never go anywhere. I'd always sort of like back off when things got serious. It was hard for me to like keep friends, and I was just mostly okay with that. I was just like, no, I'm just alone, and it's nice. And then after, I was like, oh, I don't want to do that anymore. Like, that's lonely and sad, and I need people. I need love. I need connection. I need community. And that was a totally different side of me, that it just sort of like, the whole experience just like ruptured that old self.
Wow.
And made me realize how much I need others.
Yeah.
You know.
Where did your leaving the church fall in relation to your diagnosis?
Well, so I got back from Russia when I was 21, and I was diagnosed at 30. And I had already been sort of like making my gradual exit in those years.
Yeah.
And I think I felt like I was mostly out already and done with it. But I think that the cancer also made me like investigate it even deeper in a way of like, there was a way to sort of culturally hang on to my past as a Mormon, and I was able to be kind of like do this sort of these mental gymnastics of like, well, I don't really believe in a lot of it, but hey, it's like where I'm from and who I am, and like it's okay. Like I can still kind of carry these little beliefs. And then I think the cancer made me like try to be a little bit more authentic with it. It also sort of like it woke me up to like the reality that life and death are very real things, and I need to sort of decide what I think about them in a very concrete sort of way. So I think it helped sort of push me over that last hump and to finally move on from it and not kind of have a foot on both sides of that line, you know?
For a lot of people, the cancer diagnosis moment, well, some people just receive it as, I'm going to die, which you said.
Yeah.
But I don't think anybody receives a cancer diagnosis and doesn't in some way start considering death.
Right.
And usually like more or in different ways than they did before. So kind of a left field question, but I'm curious how you understood death under a Mormon framework.
Wow. Yeah.
And then how you understand it now?
Yeah, sure. That's a great question. Under a Mormon framework, similar to most sort of Christian frameworks, I guess. I won't go into all like the nuances of how Mormon metaphysics are non-Christian, but largely, I would just say that I felt like this life was just a sort of preliminary stage to something that's coming next, and felt like that death would just be a sort of passage, to things that I could look forward to, a sort of perfected existence that we were sort of promised to be sort of one with all those who have passed. My mother died when I was 4 years old, for example.
Whoa.
And I sort of thought that, I would look forward to seeing her, and like this life just didn't really matter that much in the sense that like it's a sort of a trial period, and then the good stuff happens when you get to heaven. So like just like take the test of existence, be obedient, follow the rules, be a good person, and then you'll get to like really have like the real heaven experience. I think with cancer, what sort of really changed for me was to pay more attention to the immediacy of this world. That this, like, it became much more important, much more immediate in the sense of, like, this is all we have. And, it reminds me a lot of kind of what the sort of existentialists say about death, and they were certainly very influential for me as a teenager and a young man, just that the idea of eternal life is actually terrifying and meaningless, because if you have an infinite amount of time to do anything, then none of those actions have any meaning. But if there is the possibility that tomorrow you can't do something and that you'll be gone, then what you have here is really important. And it just really made me sort of take stock of like what really matters and what's truly important to me, and not wanting to sort of waste this life in the hopes that there's something after,
Do you mind my asking how your mom died?
Sure. Yeah, she actually had epilepsy, which is not necessarily a terminal.
Yeah.
But as I understand it, she just had a massive seizure one night and had a brain aneurysm, and it was very unexpected. My dad was out of town on business, so it wasn't like people were expecting this to happen. So yeah, and it was 1 month before I turned 5. It was certainly a very formative, traumatic experience for me.
Yeah.
But yeah, that's how she went. Yeah, pretty sudden and unexpected.
I guess the second part of the question is, how do you understand death now? Which you sort of answered already. I know how you understand life now.
Yeah, sure. I guess maybe said more about life. That's a tough question to answer. I think for me, death is an unknown and an unknowable. And I think I sort of safeguard it as that.
Yeah.
Like, I guess, I'm sort of tempted in this sort of like scientific, atheistic way to just be like, we're just like particles and dead meat and that's it. But I think, on the one hand, I do think that that's true. On the other hand, I think that death is something that we, like even the most ardent atheist believes in rather than knows. Right? Like, death is a belief.
It's totally, yeah.
You don't get to reflect on it afterwards.
Yeah.
And I think so for me, there is an element of the mystical, or it is sort of a mystical experience. It is sort of a metaphysical thing.
Yeah.
And I think I'm content to say that I don't know.
Yeah.
And I think that it is a great unknown, and I think that there's something beautiful in keeping it as an unknown rather than being able to like decide once and for all what's going to happen after. So I guess I don't know if that's quite an answer, but that's kind of how I feel about it.
That's absolutely an answer.
Yeah. Yeah.
I'm curious about the kind of timeline of your philosophy career and cancer.
Mm-hmm.
You started PhD work before your diagnosis?
Not PhD work, but I had finished a bachelor's degree in philosophy, and then I finished a master's degree in philosophy as well, and that was in London, and then I was diagnosed before I decided to go back to do the PhD. Yeah.
Yeah, so I was thinking I've had some very transformative, I guess, experiences thinking while sick.
Mm-hmm.
I feel like I learn the most when I'm really sick.
Yeah, interesting.
And usually I feel not capable of really forming thoughts or not verbal thoughts during the experience, but then sometimes I get a few words down on the page in a journal or something, but yeah, I always learn a lot from even like a bad flu. So I'm curious if you remember what it was like to be thinking, or like how, in what ways you kept thinking or reading or writing during your cancer treatment. And
yeah, good question. I think that I did have very little capacity to write at the time, but thinking, it definitely influenced me in a lot of ways. And first of all, it was very slow.
Yeah.
Like temporality in any sort of mechanical clock way just didn't exist anymore. There was no more rhythms of like economic life that I had to follow.
Yeah.
Right. And so there was a lot of time, and I think my thoughts would just kind of, there was a lot of time for things to just sort of settle and percolate. And I think for me, one of the things that was like I thought a lot about is kind of like how arbitrary our like socioeconomic world is. It's sort of arrangement that we take for granted as being so natural, as something like this is just the way that humans exist in the world, and this is like the game that we all decided to play. That all got defamiliarized really quickly. I remember it, and it kind of became a little bit absurd in a very interesting way. Just like I couldn't believe, I was just like watching people go to work and just hustle.
And
like,
you're just sitting there.
I'm just sitting there watching it pass by. And
yeah.
Like people moving boxes to another place and boxes going the other way. And I'm just like, what is this? This is crazy.
I really relate to that. Yeah. I mean, that happened to me just a week ago with the sinus infection, and then more intensely with the flu in December, and then way more intensely with COVID.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. I mean, it calls all that into question. I think part of the reason it stops making sense is to have that experience, a prolonged experience of doing nothing, and then also acknowledging that you're still a person.
Yeah, seriously, right.
It's like,
I know.
Okay.
Wait, I'm still a person, right? Like, I still exist somewhere in this.
Yeah,
totally.
I'm producing nothing.
Yeah.
But I'm still here.
Yeah, I mean, and it's true. It's a good point. You kind of start to feel erased. You start to feel a little bit like a ghost, and to sort of remember that you are still a part of this and exist and have an identity in all of it. It's kind of crazy. I mean, I think I think that those early days of, going through chemotherapy, I think I was reminded of some of those thoughts and feelings again when COVID hit, and felt like everybody could sort of get some insight into what I was feeling all of a sudden. As suddenly we all just were at home and nobody was going to work, and there was a real moment for all of us where we all paused and were like, wait, I don't have to do this shit. I don't have to go to work. I never really wanted to. And oh wait, like if things are bad enough, the government can give us some money, and like that's suddenly change, like defamiliarizes your whole context in a way that makes you think about what you want to take from it and what you don't, And I think for me, and partly because of sort of my political and philosophical leanings, it sort of drove a lot of things home that I maybe already knew, but now was experiencing in a whole new way, and just felt like it was certainly very difficult to go back afterwards.
Yeah, interesting. What did you go back to?
Oh, I was working this terrible job that I really hated. And so I'm sure that was also part of it, but it was working for this law firm, and I was poor and struggling to get by. I was taking whatever job I could get at the time, and this was a job it was a law firm that was like defending the banks in foreclosures.
Oh my god!
So it's like, here I am, like a radical leftist, like trying to like work at this job. So it was, it was nice not to be doing that, but then I think that it was just like one of the hardest things. Just, it was surprising how difficult it was to go back to the rat race.
Yeah.
I was just like, oh, I guess I didn't even think about the fact that I was going to have to go back.
Yeah.
And for a time, I was just felt like exempt from it all. And it's a bizarre experience because you're supposed to be so happy
to be done with
cancer.
Be
done.
Or
you're a survivor.
Done.
Hooray! Like life.
Yeah.
You get your life back. And I was like,
don't like it that much.
I don't know if I like it.
Yeah. Yeah, it's making me think about agency, and maybe also veering toward some of the disability studies adjacent work that you do.
Mm-hmm.
Like when you said your experience, but also the COVID experience of looking at it and having a moment to think about which parts we want.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, that's a moment of reflection that is given to people who spend a lot of time in bed.
Right.
And people who spend a lot of time in bed we think of as not having very much agency,
right.
because they can't do stuff. They can't run around and do stuff.
Right.
But there's a unique kind of agency that people working 9 to 5s don't have, because they're just running around all the time.
Right.
So, yeah.
Really good point. Yeah, it's... Yeah, like that's not... the freedoms that we take for granted is sort of like what everybody wants is just not always... It's not always freedom. It's not always agency. It's a lot of routine that's demanded of you that distracts from thinking about really important, deep, existential things. And illness can present that sort of opportunity for people, or even force it on them sometimes.
Yeah. It was something that you wrote that really struck me. You wrote, quote, "In health, the body goes mostly unnoticed." It was part of lots of other ideas, but just that one little fragment I thought was really interesting, because we talk a lot about health on the podcast, and mostly by kind of wanting to throw it away because it sounds so finite, or like something you could arrive at, something that would be like actually true.
Health?
Health.
Okay.
But I just thought that was interesting, the idea of health as kind of like the freedom to ignore your body, or like the option to not think about it.
Right. Yeah.
And so then, like, I was also thinking about the wellness craze, and even thinking about my own history of disordered eating, where I, to a doctor, was physically totally healthy, but I had this obsession with my body and dysmorphia also.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, where I was like totally like living sort of like wellness life, but I was so unwell, and so that just really resonated with me because I felt very unhealthy, if we want to use that word, because I couldn't stop thinking and worrying about my body.
Yeah, wow. So interesting.
Which, of course, what we call illness also does that. Is kind of, I mean, I don't think that's not the constant experience when you're living with illness, but it is a lot of it. Is being forced to care for, tend to, and think about your body.
Totally. Yeah, I mean, yes, it's amazing that the ways in which we don't seem to acknowledge or realize something exists until it breaks down.
Yeah.
You know? And it's also, this is also the sort of definition of privilege.
Yeah.
Privilege is something that's invisible.
Totally.
That you don't know that you have it. And this is true in sort of, if you want to look at feminist studies, you want to look at critical race theory, right? Privilege is always something that goes unacknowledged.
Yeah.
And there's a level of ignorance that goes along with it. And I think for me, like I've talked about it with some friends before also, as like being a man and, coming into an awareness of, feminist theory, feminist philosophy. Health was a type of privilege for me as a man where I didn't think about my body and I didn't have an engagement with it in a very real way. And cancer sort of disrupted that for me as well. Like no longer, like my body was doing stuff that I didn't expect it to do and had its like own agenda, its own plan. And it sort of like made me realize that, health is a privilege in all kinds of senses of that word. It's like, it's not to disparage it in any way, but it's to acknowledge that if you're only experiencing yourself as healthy, it's harder to have sympathy and empathy with others who are not always feeling that.
Yeah.
And health, in disability studies, the idea of health, the idea of normalcy, these are all very troubled ideas. Some scholars would speak of them as illusions. And insofar as we are finite, we are all going to die, and breakdown is inevitable. And so health is a difficult thing to define in a certain way. There's never a possibility of just being purely healthy. There's always something going on. And I think it's helpful to sort of think about these things in a sort of dialectical relationship where you don't just have health and then you don't, but it's like a progression of a life. You're always engaged. You're always like flirting with illness. It's always coming for you here and there, and you don't have to be afraid of it. And so, I think that's kind of what I was thinking about with that. And, health is sort of an invisible thing in a lot of ways.
It is. And because it is, it also makes me think about conscious or unconscious choices of how much we think about health, and in terms of who moves through the world thinking of themselves as healthy. And like, for example, before the moment of your diagnosis, you, I think, move through the world thinking of yourself as a healthy person, but all that stuff was already inside you for who knows how long.
Totally.
So it's just, again, I love this idea of health where all it means is that the body is going unnoticed. And it's actually not a physical description.
Totally. That's really good. Yeah, it's so true. And it's a good example too, because it's so funny, because I mean, here I was having all these crazy symptoms.
Sure, right. It wasn't totally unnoticed.
No, but still, like, even then, I still sort of thought of myself, I'm healthy.
Yeah.
But I'm healthy.
Know,
like it's like in the sense that it can be a sort of overriding ideology sometimes. I mean, and I guess in some ways I was just being stupid and like not really listening to my body.
Sure.
But like that's those things are all tangled up.
It's how we're trained. Also, I mean, is to not listen much to the body. I think something that's so powerful about disability studies and disability justice is it's like people coming together and choosing to listen to their bodies and share experiences of listening to the body, because again, like two people with very similar physical realities, one person can be listening to their body and kind of choosing to relate to how fragile the body is, how debilitating certain things are, which I think often can't help but overlap with like how exhausting it is to work a job in capitalism,
right.
or how terrible your relationship with your mother is. Like all these when you're listening to your body, those things are impossible to tune out. You notice like, oh, I'm so fatigued all the time because of these really difficult external circumstances. Or like I'm getting migraines all the time because like my neighbors are fighting and it's stressful or whatever, you know. And it's like somebody who lets themselves take a day off work or whatever, like kind of allows those physical responses. It might be called sick.
Yes.
You know? Whereas someone who pushes them down for a time is called healthy until maybe they get cancer.
Yeah, it's such a good point. I mean, it's right. I mean, you know, I'm in psychoanalytic training, and I think, you know, one of the sorts of basic formulas that I find so interesting is that in processes of repression, symptoms arise in the body. Right. And it's not just, there's no like real separation between the body and the mind in the way that we tend to think they are separated. But you do try to repress things like illness. You do try to repress things like death. And you do try to repress all kinds of stuff that's very hard to face.
Yeah.
But your body will tell you if you're doing okay, and you're going to have some symptoms. And so it's very true that like it's important to face psychologically what's leading to these symptoms in the body, and like you said, listening to your body can really clue you into what's going on. So yeah, I find that really interesting.
Have you developed any practices maybe that have to do with listening to your body? But I'm also curious, like returning to the way that your diagnosis made you become less of a lone wolf. Like, I'm curious to hear a little bit about materially how your life changed, or like what new things you do.
I mean, my life changed a lot. I mean, I fell in love right away for the first time. Met somebody like days after my last radiation treatment. Found a little community, you know, and like lived a much more, I guess, experimental life, socially speaking. And
what does that mean?
Well, I tried psychedelic drugs. And none of this to me felt like a conscious choice of like, oh, now I'm better, I need to go try and bust out my shell. It just like all happened.
Wow.
It all just happened like kind of right away. And in retrospect, I definitely was craving more like mind expanding experiences. Was much more open to love, much more open to figuring out what's out there in the world and sharing it with others. And so love became very expansive, community became expansive. Tried some alternative drugs and had some cool experiences with that. Sort of looked into like sort of psychonaut culture, and as a philosophy person, that's always very interesting to me. So I definitely, like, I was all very different than what I came out of before cancer. And I think it's just kind of funny that in retrospect, I didn't really, it's not like I was like making a conscious choice to do any of that. It just all kind of like came to me.
But there was probably some kind of new openness, it
100%.
sounds like you
Definitely.
were ready to accept that kind of stuff where you probably were blocked off to it before.
Definitely. That's exactly it. I mean, I just think I would have ended up closing off in some way. I would have like maybe flirted with it and then retreated to the sort of safety of my bubble, but no more.
Psychedelics are terrifying if you're trying to retreat from them.
Right. Yeah, exactly.
Terrible.
Totally. Yeah, it's but if you're open for it and you're ready to receive it, there's beautiful things to find. But it is a sort of set and setting as psychedelic culture always talks about. Makes very important. I wasn't ready for it before, and cancer opened me up to all kinds of experiences. There's no question about it.
Yeah, and you're still choosing to be in this world of philosophy, which is a world of ideas. So I'm also curious about like your current experience of your body in relation to your work. Yeah,
it's definitely, I mean, I won't bore you with too much of the sort of philosophical details, but certainly like I became much more interested in like the sort of fleshy body matter of thinking, much more, than the sort of transcendental and sort of rather than the sort of mind side of philosophy. I was interested in the body side of philosophy a lot, and sort of getting to the real stuff. And I found myself interested in those trajectories of philosophy much more than I would have before, and sort of seeking those thinkers that were invested in the body, invested in the real. And ever since then, I've sort of been interested in those types of questions, those types of philosophies, very much so.
So relating the body and philosophy, you've talked about terminal diagnosis. Well, relating the body and philosophy, but specifically this context of climate chaos that we're living in, and trying to think about that, thinking about it in relation to bodily experience. You wrote about climate catastrophe as a sort of terminal diagnosis for the world as we know it, maybe?
Yeah.
Yeah, can you say a little bit more about that? I'm curious, I think I was reading it a few different ways, and on the one hand, maybe say a person with cancer is kind of analogous to the planet with climate catastrophe, or is it a microcosm? And then at the same time, the environmental destruction that humans have created is directly just causing cancer in people.
Right.
So there are a lot of different ways that those two things line up, and I'm curious about all of them. But.
Yeah, sure. I mean, I think it's a complicated metaphor in some ways, just because I don't want it to sound too like apocalyptic or something like that, right? Like, the Earth's going to be okay, and species will die, but it's not like everything explodes and everything's gone. Like, that's not how this is going to go. But I think the metaphor I'm trying to work with in terms of this terminal diagnosis, I mean, certainly this is kind of what the scientists are telling us, that when I was doing some research on, these accounts from geologists, their response is as if they got a terminal diagnosis,
Totally.
They're looking at the data, and
Fatalistic.
they're like, we're done. Like, that's it.
Yeah.
Like, I have all the evidence, I see all the numbers.
Yeah.
And it can only be slightly worse than this, and probably not a lot better. So I think, but for me, I think what's so valuable about that as a metaphor is for the same things we sort of talked about earlier, that it reshifts a sort of focus onto what we want to do in our final chapter. And maybe there will be more, but I think that what a lot of my work tries to do is it tries to help us think through limits, that there are limits, and that's a logic that capitalism cannot understand, for example.
Right.
Capitalism has no conception
no
of
limits.
limit.
Just progress.
Yeah, progress, infinite accumulation, right? Infinite growth. It's a system that demands, it doesn't ask for it, it demands infinite growth, therefore infinite consumption. It has no concept of a limit. So I think for me, in thinking through what, hopefully we can be in a position to organize a different world in the sort of ruins of this one. And I think one step is to come to terms with limits for ourselves, to stop thinking about health, to stop thinking about, I'm going to just transcend this and we're going to keep going no matter what.
Yeah.
I think there's a real important moment. It doesn't have to be the final moment. We don't have to just say, oh, we're going to die and give up all hope. That is definitely not what I'm saying.
Yeah.
But it's in that same way that it reorients us away from, I guess what I would see as theological ideas that push us into the heavens and into eternity, and where we can continue to do this forever. It instead shifts our focus not upwards, but towards each other, right? Look around, not ahead, is the idea. Look around you, not ahead. It's time to stop. And that implies that we need to care for one another in ways that we haven't been able to do. We have to look at each other as as people who are in a situation of a terminal position. How would you treat your family and friends if they got a terminal diagnosis? How would that change society if we all started to think about it this way?
If we treated everybody that way, regardless of medical diagnosis.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Right? Suddenly, now it's pressing. Now it's here. It's no longer in the future. It's no longer a question of limitless progression. It's a cultivating, like, if the science is as scary as they say it is, then can we at least in our last chapter care for one another, and like and maybe leave that question open for something else. But like, it will, I think the question of limits in terms of a terminal diagnosis is sort of the metaphor I'm trying to think through for each other. It's real. It's much more real than the logic of capital, for example, which can only, unfortunately, it can only worsen and deepen the crisis, precisely because its logic is something that's limitless.
Yeah.
So that's my hope, I guess, in that. Like, it's maybe a dark hope. It sounds pessimistic to like think through a sort of terminal diagnosis, but that's also just like what the science says. You know,
looking around is not pessimistic at all.
I don't think
it's
so.
It's not necessarily optimistic either.
Right.
And just for listeners, when you refer to like the end of a world, can you describe what that world is? What's ending?
I don't mean the end of the planet. So there's a distinction between planet and world that's very important. The planet is like an ecological biosphere, is something that will continue to sort of evolve and persist. When I speak of world, I think I'm speaking much more about a sort of global ideology of world that we have. We sort of take it for granted that we're all in the world together without pausing to consider the ways in which this world is a type of ideological construction that we all share. We all kind of sustain that fiction together. It's necessary for civilization, etc. But it's important to be able to defamiliarize that notion, to pause for a minute and notice how illusory it is, in order not to destroy it, but in order to create a different one.
It's like, we made it, we can make something different.
Exactly, yeah. And I think it's just become, with the internet and the rise of sort of globalism, it's very easy to forget. Baudrillard talks about this as the perfect crime, is that once we all knew that the world was an illusion, and we've all forgotten that. Now we take it as something that's absolutely natural. And critical race theorists talk about this a lot as well. Fanon, Aimé Césaire, they talk about their radical project is one to bring about the end of the world, which sounds apocalyptic. But that's not what they mean.
No, they
mean this thought world, this
ideologies we take for granted.
That's right. This sort of this white Western hegemonic view of what we all share as a civilization is a very specific one. It's not the only one. And so it's not about the end of the planet. It's not about destroying lives or living organisms. It's about letting an ideology pass.
Yeah.
Like that's outlived its usefulness.
Yeah.
It's okay. It got us far, but maybe it's now this shared notion of world is not adequate to a sort of ecological change that we need to shift. And so then we can talk about things like degrowth, we can talk about finding harmony with ecology, but also all kinds of socioeconomic, cultural arrangements that we want to sort of share, hopefully, a new idea of civilization, share a new world, one that's not predicated on consumption and destruction, you know? So that's the idea.
And, when we get sick, or when we come close to something like cancer or something like COVID, when I'm inside the experience of illness, I sometimes feel like COVID, for example, is an ally in bringing about the end of the world. Obviously, it also is a force of destruction and a lot of tragedy. But when COVID was in my body, I had this sense that we could work with COVID and listen to COVID exactly in order to see and then say goodbye to that world. Yeah,
it was beautiful. I mean, I had the same thought. I think a lot of listeners can relate to that. I started writing my dissertation before COVID, and I was thinking about these ideas. I was using these metaphors. I was and then suddenly COVID happened, and I was like, oh man, I have nothing else to say. Like now it's already in the streets, happening. And it's like why do I even Why am I going to keep writing?
Right.
But I think we can all relate to that. Also, it's not a coincidence that, like the George Floyd uprisings happened.
No.
Right. And like we have a moment. COVID is a moment for us to reassess what we want and what we're willing to take. And I remember having that moment, and maybe in part because of my cancer experience, because of remembering that, I have to go back to the rat race after this.
Yeah.
That I remember during COVID having that moment of like real sadness because I was overcome with hope for the pause that this gave us.
Yeah.
Like you said, it's an ally in this fight. It gives us a whole new perspective. We don't have to do this anymore. We can do something else. And then I remembered, we're going to go back to business as usual. It's going to happen. And I was like, oh no.
Yeah.
And it's kind of where we are a little bit.
Yeah.
And hopefully
it's kind of business as usual.
It ebbs and flows, but I think compared to the excitement of that moment for imagining new worlds is settling back into business as usual. But there's going to be more opportunities, I'm afraid, for better and for worse.
Yeah.
But I think these are things to remember in times of mass illness, which we probably won't see the end of that.
Yeah.
And that's part of my research and thinking through human bodies as sort of deposits of like ecological collapse, not just like ice core samples and like geologic layers in the rock, but like the human body is an index of those microplastics, of those toxins. What's going on in Ohio right now that the media is not talking about. All these Superfund sites, Flint, Michigan, Fukushima, the body is depositing all of this. It's taking record of all of this destruction. So, which is to say, there will be more opportunities for us to reassess.
And also, we always have that option on the very local level. Like this conversation,
exactly.
we're acknowledging what it is, and we're acknowledging what we want it to be.
Yeah.
And that's always there.
Totally.
Anything else you want to share?
Man, we covered a lot. I think this has been very interesting for me to have this conversation with you. I really appreciate it. Thanks for the opportunity.
If you enjoyed this conversation, please leave a review in your podcast app. Cancer Talks is a platform for anyone who has been touched by cancer. Write to us at info@cancertalks.com if you have a story to share. If you're moved to donate, please visit cancertalks.com/donate.